to Seat at My Table. Today I am extremely excited to be joined by Rachel Laryea, who is an absolute rock star and does so much. So she started her career at Goldman Sachs in finance, then did a PhD at Yale, currently works for JP Morgan, which we'll go into more, but more recently, she's released an incredible book called Black Capitalists. And again, we'll go more into that, describing what that really means, as well as on the side of this, having a lifestyle brand called Kelly, which is not only a food brand that's centered around plantain, but also has destinations that you can go and stay in, which is a really interesting idea. And before further ado, I'd love to go to Rachel and ask that you describe yourself in 3 words.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. If I had to describe myself in 3 words, I would say thoughtful, industrious, and honestly chill. Those would be my 3 words.
I think that is amazing. So I'm already getting that energy from you. But honestly, if people look at your resume and what you've achieved, it's unbelievable that you can also be chill when you're balancing so many different plates.
Mm,
And the one thing I was worried about in today's conversation is actually getting through everything that I wanted to talk to you about, because I got the chance to read your book, which is inspiring and educational, and I would recommend everyone reading it. But I also want to talk more about you as a person and how you've achieved so much and what drives you.
mm,
So I think the best place to start is actually going back to younger Rachel,
mm,
and maybe your first experience, I guess, of capitalism and how you interacted with that. I know that you speak in your book a lot about watching your mum obviously come over to the US, work really hard, and you describe how she'd wake you up at 4:30 a.m. to do chores, study, all before you went to school.
yeah.
So I'd love to just touch on that and let you kind of explain that experience yourself.
Yeah, it was quite the upbringing. And I think it was all predicated on my mom's understanding that in order for her children, I think from her perspective, to be well equipped to just handle anything that living in America might throw at two young Black children, she really believed in the importance of a really strong work ethic, and also this idea that education is the way out. And the question being, out of what? Honestly, poor life chances and also poverty. Because my mom, she worked 2 jobs, 7 days a week for my entire childhood. And so for her, it was really about how can I make sure my kids don't also have this experience? And so that translated into a really intense, I would say, level of discipline and just chores and steady, really rigorous in a way to, I think, build our threshold for excellence and striving for excellence. And then ultimately, I think she was right. Education did become our way out because I had the benefit of academic scholarships that allowed me to go to really incredible academic institutions and enrichment programs that I think really shifted the trajectory of my life, honestly. But it really started with my mom's um, deep belief in if you're going to do something, you have to do it 100% or don't do it at all. And having that kind of work ethic in us. And then also, I think so much of my childhood was really rooted in having a Ghanaian experience, even though I was living in America. And so for my mom, she never saw her kind of living in America as her home. It was always kind of a temporary place. And so every day, I'd wake up, she'd be calling my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, and they'd be speaking in the local language. And so I was always kind of reminded of where I came from, even though I was born and raised in America for the most part. And so she always wanted to, I think, instill that sense of culture and identity in us as well. And I think that also really shaped not just my understanding of my Black identity, but then also my Ghanaian identity as well in an American context, what it might mean for me to experience difference, not just on the racial level, but also when it comes to ethnicity and nationality. And so those were some of the key kind of aspects that I think really formulated my childhood. But yeah, my mom was a disciplinarian, and I didn't appreciate it then, but now, The older I get, the more I appreciate my mom and kind of her approach to child rearing, because I do think that what I've been able to do now in my career personally is so much tied to kind of her initial thinking about how can I really raise children to withstand anything, the
Mhm.
world throws at them.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like you said, it's paid off. I know you and your brother are doing amazing things. I think what's so interesting when you read more about your story is, so you went to I don't, is it a prep school? Is that what it's called in the
Yeah.
US? And there's this kind of a dichotomy of thinking I had to come here on a scholarship. I had to work really hard, but I'm surrounded by all this privilege, but I'm also privileged because I'm here. And, from a really young age, you see how you are, I guess, confronted with all of these different ideas. And so it's amazing to hear that you kind of had that at home where, your mom was talking to your family back in Ghana. But what was that experience like when you were young? And I remember being young and trying to discover who I was. And almost I remember you spoke about eating is it banku in the cupboard
Yeah.
because someone made a comment about the smell. How was that experience as a young girl? Being safe in the home to be Ghanaian, and then all of a sudden you're at school and it's not so safe.
Yeah, it was tough. I think that that experience really ruptured for me any kind of narrative about blackness as a monolith, because there's so much diversity, there's so much complexity within the black lived experience. And I saw that front and center, I think, as I was seeing the very few black American students that were on campus, but then also distinctions for, say, myself having a Ghanaian experience. Like, yes, I was born and raised in America and I'm American, but I was having a very Ghanaian experience in America. And so I felt cultural differences, even amongst people who looked like me. And I realized that, racial solidarity isn't always a guarantee, especially when you have those kind of ethnic or cultural differences. And, as you kind of rightly call out that experience of indicators of my own cultural identity, like food. And so whenever my mom would bring me Ghanaian food, I would always feel so comforted, but at the same time, I was always having to kind of negotiate my sense of identity within the context of which I was and the space in which I was, and having that not always received well. And it's a crazy thing where now I think you see how Ghana's kind of on the world stage. So many people are going there and traveling and eating banku and fufu, and they have jollof wars and all of these incredible things. But had you told me as a teenager
Yeah,
eating, Ghanaian food in the storage closet because people thought it was weird or smelled funny, that it would be cool to be Ghanaian, I wouldn't have believed you.
yeah,
And so you just see so much of the evolution now, but at that time, it was really difficult to figure out all of this as a kid and not really even have the language for it. But, how do I be Black in a way that's going to be received well by my Black American peers? How do I also hold on to my Ghanaian identity in a way that I can show pride, because I was proud of it, but was meant to feel almost embarrassed by it? And so all of these complexities, I think for me, it's stayed with me in terms of like questions that I would spend, years, even up to today, like trying to find answers to. But it's tough. It's tough being a teenager already, but
yeah.
to then have to kind of wrestle with your identity on so many different levels on top of it, while also just trying to get good grades and maintain your position in a place. It definitely feels like high stakes. But I think, you know, as I mentioned before, my mom, I think her training and just the kind of resilience and determination that she really instilled in me and my brother also showed up there, in terms of how I could just try to get through some of those really difficult kind of navigation experiences, to then come out of it and feel like, okay, I might not have the answers, but I'm going to continue to try to figure this out. And it's interesting that it's shown up in the way that it has, where now I'm an anthropologist and study culture and identity. But yeah, it was a time.
Yeah. And I think it's so beautiful to understand more about your childhood and those experiences. And it's always amazing when you see how it's woven through the person and who they are now. And obviously, the fact that you're an anthropologist and you've had the chance, or not even had the chance, you've decided to interview, I think it was over 200 people for this book that you've written. And so much of your work is about understanding people, how they interact with society and the economy, and then actually helping people feel more empowered
Mhm.
everywhere, in society, in the business world, financial world, etc. And I think it's always beautiful to see almost how you became the person that you are today.
Yeah.
I think something that I also want to touch on that really stuck with me and kind of staying with you as you were younger is the fact that obviously you had this role model of someone who worked relentlessly and always had to do that to survive and to lift up her children and make sure that they were secure. And then that was kind of drilled into you, and then you went to school. And I remember there was a part in your book where you said, if you even got a C, you could lose this position. And I can't imagine the feeling as such a young girl having that much pressure. It was almost though it is this constant survival. You have to be 100% all the time. And obviously, as a child in a more privileged situation where that's not the case and you have this security net and that's not even a thought in your mind. It's, oh, who am I going to be friends with today? Or, what do I actually want to do when I'm older? Oh, let's just go and like try it out. And, my parents can fund it. And,
Mhm.
the level of pressure at such a young age to be relentless. I can't imagine what that was like. And obviously you can see how it's fed through into adulthood because you've achieved so much. But
Yeah.
how has it been getting older and almost working to give yourself more of like a feeling of security and maybe fight that feeling of like lack of security at a young age? Obviously, now that you've kind of reached a level of success and financial stability, how
Yeah.
has that journey been?
Yeah. It's been one of incredible, I think, intentionality and self awareness to even arrive at, because there is that irony whereby you chase financial security, but to be a Black person, especially in America, the idea of security isn't always guaranteed, especially physical security over one's body. But that is also what propels you to further strive for a greater amount of financial security, because that becomes in some ways your protection to a degree, because it's a very precarious position to be both poor and Black. um, and so I think for me, when I was recruited to work at Goldman Sachs while in undergrad, and I don't know if you've ever seen Industry or some of those shows about high finance, where they kind of tell those stories around the internship, and getting that full time offer. And I experienced that where it's like so much pressure. And I think the pressure for me felt very different than other members in my cohort who had family members in finance and might have even got them the internship in some cases, where I was here totally on my own merit. And I was competing against people who had nothing to lose. Whereas for me, it was like this was at that time what I saw as the only entry point to kind of shift my financial future. And so I think being able to even secure the full time offer after the internship, I can remember that feeling of just a weight being lifted,
Yeah.
because I no longer had this like great sense of worry about, okay, what am I going to do after college? Like, especially at that time, I was wanting to go into higher education and go to grad school, which conceivably might have meant like more debt to take on, or just I didn't have a path forward for like an actual quality of life and a kind of salary that would allow for a life of comfort and ease. And so I think that first kind of foray into financing on Wall Street really kind of shifted my own sense of um, comfort, also my sense of, okay, like this is working, like there's a road ahead that I don't have to worry so much. And not just for myself, but also for my family as well. And so that I think kind of got me on a certain trajectory. And then it also kind of opened up my mind and thinking around, okay, the different kind of strategies I can take to create financial security for myself. I knew at that time I still wanted to go to grad school. And so I said, okay, I can save X amount of money because I'm working at Goldman and have excess resources in order to then pursue an arguably like precarious, you know, career in academia, because I think for so many reasons, academia and that as a job market doesn't have many opportunities. And so that then became my strategy. And then even when I was in grad school, got super disillusioned with academia. I then turned back to industry as a place where I thought, okay, I've been able to reach a level of security. I can go back. I know how this works. And then create, you know, the steps, if you will, to then achieving kind of wealth creation, start really investing in smart ways. And so I think it really opened, it being my experience at Goldman, the aperture for my own understanding about how I can achieve financial security. And then through doing so, kind of lessen the anxiety and worry that I had as a kid, you know, growing up with very limited financial means. So yeah, that became so much of my, I think, evolution. It
Yeah.
became about what are the strategies I can take on to lessen the sense of fear, honestly, and then create avenues for me to almost build a like financial fortress around myself and my family. But again, it's been challenging and kind of hard won, and there's still questions of like, oh, I could be doing more. There are other ways in which I can always make sure that I'm creating a safety net wide enough that's going to actually, you know, take care of me and my family in the long term. But that was
Mm.
always top of mind because, again, I always felt like I had something to lose and the stakes were higher
Yeah.
because of the situation I was in.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine when you watch your mum work so hard, you also feel as though you owe it to her and you want to take
Yeah.
pressure off of her as well. And I guess before we move on to more into this, it's probably quite important to actually refer to what your book is about. And almost for people who aren't used to vocabulary describing society and economic system, obviously capitalism is an economic system that we live in at the moment, in which market forces are at play, private individuals and businesses own the capital, and really the motivation is ultimately profit in the society. Of course, when you look at how this then interacts with different people within society, and when you look at the Black community, for example, what I have always found interesting, what obviously your book is about, is this judgment or this confrontation that people who belong to a community that you could argue actually was exploited in order to allow capitalism to be successful, there's almost this judgment, this confrontation internally of, well, should I be participating in the system, you know, working in finance, trying to make money, if it was ultimately built on exploitation of my ancestors, or still currently now, of course, this is still going on all the time. So I guess going back to what you just said about being younger and being in the banking world and the finance world, and also talking about the program industry, I would love to talk a bit more about how you actually started thinking about that when you entered the finance world. I know, obviously from my own experience, what it can require from you to participate in the system. But then, of course, there's intersections of that, being Black, being female. And so I'd just love to start there and then let you kind of talk a bit about that and your book as well.
Yeah. So while I was in NYU for undergrad, I was a social and cultural analysis major. And so that was really kind of interdisciplinary. And it was really a degree in critical thinking. And within that, I had a particular focus on Black studies and metropolitan studies. And um, within that context, so much of my training was rooted in critical race theory and the Black radical tradition, which has very particular teachings and insights about Black people's relationship to capitalism in ways that are rooted in the history and the creation of Western capitalism and how it's really been a tool by which Black people have been exploited and white people have been the beneficiaries of capitalism. And so that was my kind of theoretical foundation for so much of my thinking. And by the time I got to Goldman, it was the case that so many of my peers, they were going on to more arguably altruistic careers. And, I would get critiqued like, how could you go to Wall Street, the belly of the beast, when
Yeah.
been trained in the way that you are, have had the personal experiences that I've had? How could you do it? And it was quite simple. It was like, I do not want to be poor
Yeah.
for the rest of my life. And so that in and of itself was its own kind of, I think, critique around how we expect certain groups of people to not pursue
Mm.
different opportunities because there's an expectation about the kind of relationship Black people in this case should have to wealth and economic thriving. And so that was so much of the discourse. But so when I got to Goldman, what really was profound for me was seeing how Black professionals were both critical of capitalism, critical of the forms of exploitation and extraction that it reproduces and the harms that it reproduces. But they were also very strategic in their usage of the tools of capitalism
Mm.
to create excess resources for themselves and their communities. And so here I was, and I was like, man, how do you reckon with all of this? Like the teaching that I was trained in, but then also the reality of these people and how they were doing this complicated, nuanced thing that I think spoke to what this moment, this life that we live demands of us. We live in contradictions all of the time.
Mm.
I think if you take America, for example, America is a contradiction. The West is a contradiction built on violence and exploitation. And yet, for so many people, it becomes home, it becomes a safe haven. And we wrestle with all of these things that don't quite make sense, but we navigate it every day.
Mm.
So, why not navigate the economic system as well? Because we do, whether we be passive agents in it or active agents who kind of assume a kind of agentic posture and feel like we have some say in the systems that define our lives. And so that for me became this kind of theoretical journey to undergo, whereby for myself too, it was thinking, how do I make sense of this? How do I make sense of, some of the shame I had of working on Wall Street and people having their judgments about that, but then also taking responsibility for myself and knowing that, okay, I might be in this space. I know how critical people are of that. I also know the history of Wall Street and its relationship to the Black community. So what do I do about that in the capacity that I have to make change or do something? And so that then became my orientation, because I think what's so important is to be pragmatic and realistic about
Mm.
the moment that we're in. And again, so much of my training was rooted in, say, even the teachings of Audre Lorde, where she said the famous line, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
Yeah.
And people often say that to me when I, come and tell this story about Black capitalists. But for me, it's the reality that capitalism is here. It is enduring. It's not going to be
Mm.
dismantled tomorrow. So how do we get from this space that we're in to that next kind of liberatory future? And so the in between space is what we have to deal with.
Mm.
We have capitalism that we're existing in today, and sometimes the features and the functions of capitalism are so close we can't even see it, but we sit in all of this. So what do we do with an imperfect system? And that's where I offer and really kind of create the concept for the book is based on the lived experiences of people and the reality that race makes a difference in how we participate in capitalism. And that difference teaches all of us something about how to use the tools of capitalism differently in the present moment to help us get to a more liberatory future.
Mm.
It's not an argument to say that capitalism is good. No, but it is an argument to say that the tools of capitalism can be neutral rather than racialized as they have been.
Mm.
So, how do we think about it anew in order to create just a bit more equity, just a bit more justice in our current realities? And so, that's what really got me, I think, excited to endeavor to write the book, but then also sit with all of the tensions and contradictions, and I've been critiqued plenty because I think it's hard for people to imagine being on the right side of something when you've been on the wrong side of it for so long, for yourself, but also intergenerationally. But I think for such a time as this, it's important to have hope and the belief in new possibilities. And what's so cool to me is that there's evidence for it. So it's not something that we just have to dream up and imagine. It's actually tangible evidence for how people are doing it today. So then it becomes more so a conversation around how do we align as a community in terms of our beliefs about our relationship to capitalism and then our behaviors and how we participate in it in order to, again, get us towards that more liberatory future.
Yeah. And I think there's so much in this that is so powerful. And it's so nice because when I saw you say, there's proof of this, kind of your face lit up and you can feel the hope coming from you. And I think that is so powerful because something that's so important is that you mentioned is that at the moment we live in a capitalist society. And so to judge people and to critique people for wanting to partake in it is actually, again, asking them to, like you mentioned in your book, kind of wake up on the wrong side of capitalism every day. And, you can't pretend like it's not there. And so if you don't partake in it, then you're going to keep kind of having to live in this struggle. And also it might not change because people who want it to change aren't partaking in it. And then, that we do live in a world where money is power, unfortunately. I do think it's so unjust, and I love the fact that you do confront this in your book in the sense that there is so much unpaid labor for Black professionals in the sense that when you are in that system, you're expected to bring people up. You're expected to mentor the Black professionals coming in if you're an executive. You're expected to create the networks, put on the events, and ultimately try and change the system within, which is extremely positive. And I'm extremely grateful for anyone who's doing that work. And I would love to think that I'm also someone who wants to do that work and create definitely a more equal society. But also it's exhausting. It's like you also deserve the right to live a happy life full of ease, And I feel as though there's a lot of rhetoric that can also be used by white people as well to stop Black people from accessing the benefits of capitalism by making them feel judged for wanting luxury and ease. And so I think what I loved about your book is the hopeful side and the encouragement to show people that just because this is how capitalism has been used previously and what it looks like, it doesn't mean it has to keep looking like that.
Yeah.
So that's also another thing why I want people to read the book and also understand, like you said, it can be so invisible in how we partake in capitalism. And I think your book allows people to think more carefully how they are kind of acting within that. I would love to talk about as well. I mean, there's honestly, my mind is buzzing because you do so much. It's like, I just can imagine talking to you for hours. More generally, your brand Kilowelly as well. And obviously being an employer and starting this company, there's multiple facets of this that I want to talk about. One of them is how did you balance your time, firstly, when you're in finance or writing a book or interviewing 200 people? How did you actually find the time to do this? I know that's a passion of yours, but what has your life looked like in the last
Yeah.
couple of years?
It was nuts. I gotta say. Um, oh my goodness. Yeah, so I started Kalawele back in 2018, and the genesis for it was really rooted in culture. So Kalawele, long before it was the name of my business, it's the name of a popular Ghanaian street food. It's basically ripe plantains that you cut up, you put some, seasoning, spices on them, especially ginger. You fry it, and it's the best thing ever. And so that was a dish my mom would make for me as a kid sometimes, and I just loved it. I think over the years, plantains meant different things to me, and they had added significance in my life. Starting first when I moved to New York City to do school, I kind of transitioned into a plant-based diet, and plantains kind of became my dairy and meat substitute, and so it was great. Fast forward a couple more years, I started grad school, And we anthropologists were kind of always thinking about culture and the question of culture, how it's sustained, how people derive identity from it, etc. And I kind of had this light bulb moment of thinking about food and foodways as a way to think about culture. What I loved was that I can be West African, the next person from the Caribbean, the next person from Latin America, and we all have these shared kind of relatability and familiarity with plantains, even if we're preparing them very differently. And so all of that kind of became the ingredients to building and creating Callaway, really focused on innovation, creativity, but also really centering African foodways throughout the diaspora as well, because I found that especially in, being plant-based, I'd go to the grocery store and I'd look at the vegan aisle and nothing resonated with me culturally. And so I wanted to build a brand that really did that. And then over time had the inclusion of the travel experiences and really bringing people back to the continent as well. Um, but all of this became an idea that I got so passionate about, like arguably at the worst time. I'm 1 year into grad school at this point. I'm writing and reading more than I even thought humanly possible. And I was like writing papers by day, peddling plantains by night, and just hustling. I write about hustle culture in the book. And, I think so much of that work ethic, when I talk back about, the way my mother raised me, just felt like, okay, this is what I want to do. I've committed myself to it. So I'm going to do it 100%, or I'm not going to do it at all, for better or for worse. And so I think what helped, though, is that I was really intentional about using institutional resources to help me in that endeavor. And I think one of the great benefits of being at Yale at that time was that it's incredibly resource rich as an institution, and they've built, sub institutions within the university really focused on student entrepreneurs. And so I was able to, tap into the City Center that really focuses on helping student entrepreneurs, whether it be through monetary resources, human capital support, mentorship. And so I kind of lived there when I wasn't in class. And they really helped me in so many different ways. I was part of their fellowship program, and they became a really critical piece when I then kind of leveled up the business to create a brick and mortar in Brooklyn. And then also when I had a location at the Barclays Center as well in Brooklyn. And so they really helped. And then also just tapping into different incubators and leveraging even my past relationships. So at this time, I was an alum of Goldman, but they have their 10,000 Small Businesses program. And I was able to participate in that incubator program. So again, just like gather as many of these resources as possible to like make this thing work, because I had no experience in restaurants, brick and mortars, restaurant operations, none of that. But through the help of all of these different incubators, these institutional resources, was able to really kind of put a team together, have an understanding of even cost models, profitability models, all of that. While also, I think, doing the work of having a kind of Black capitalist framework and orientation to building a business, because in the definition rather that you gave of capitalism, it's really focused on private ownership and profitability. Whereas when you have a kind of Black capitalist orientation, it's not just about profitability, but really and foremost about people, and ensuring that people feel valued for their intrinsic value as people, not just for the output that they create that you then attach monetary capital to. Um, and building a culture where people are excited to show up to work every day and it feels communal and there's a vested interest in everybody that's shared. And so those questions are not your typical questions when you're just being an entrepreneur within a capitalist framework. But those were the questions I knew I had to ask myself, because again, I think there's some responsibility that we all share, that we all have to own in terms of how we show up in capitalism, given the hats that we wear, entrepreneur, professional, what have you. And so it was very challenging to kind of sit with that and even be in conversation with my team about what they desire, what are their hopes and dreams, kind of financial futures they want for themselves, but also just the lives they want to live, and how can their engagement with Kelowele be an unlock in some ways, in whatever way possible, to that. And yeah, always being in that kind of spirit and ethos, which was hard, while also just trying to graduate from school.
Honestly,
Uh,
it's so
yeah.
impressive. Yeah. And actually, it was so perfect that I'm speaking to you today in many ways because so I'm part of an organization that actually has a workforce in Ghana as well, in Accra. And then they also like founded in London by two amazing founders, Izzy Obeng and Cecil Ajale. And they have their flagship event today. And so I was there this morning and I'm on their community advisory board. I'm honestly obsessed with this company and organization. And I was talking to Cecil, so the co-founder today. And basically, the aim of this organization is to break down barriers to innovation and entrepreneurship, to help give founders access to networks, resources, funding. They're doing amazing things. And I was talking to Cecil and a friend called Richard as well. And I mentioned I was talking to you and I said that you have this brown curry. They're like, no way. That's one of my favorite dishes. And we were talking about it. And honestly, their face lit up. And then they're like, but wait, we would have heard of this brand because she can't be based in London. I was like, no, she's based in New York. They're like, definitely. If there was a company called Kelowele and this was being sold here in London, we would know about it. And you could just
Wow.
see the connection instantly. When people hear that and it resonates with them. And there's such a beauty in that, and the fact that you're bringing that to other people, and of course, hearing the way that you think about being the owner of a business. So the fact that you're thinking about how you show up to work, how you're showing up for your employees, that you're asking them what they want from the job. It's not, what do I want from you so that my business is successful? The way in which you're participating is so thoughtful, going back to how you described yourself. And this is ultimately what I'm so passionate about and why it's so important to see different people who are using the tools of capitalism. Because if more business owners were like you, the world would be a very different place. And so I think that's really powerful. And I love that you're setting that example. And actually, what I love about your book, and I can imagine part of the reason that you can see hope on your face when you talk about this, is the people that you have spoken to, like Sangu, for example. Is it Sangu? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and, there was something that really resonated with me. And it was such a small act that you noted down when you were, I guess, foreshadowing Sangu and his company. And it was at the Christmas party where the food came out and the women jumped up and went and started helping to stand behind and serve people. And the fact that what Sangu did was go and gather men, get them to go behind where the food was, and it didn't stop until it was equal. And it's those, what seems like small acts that maybe someone wouldn't have even noticed, but it's that commitment to slowly change behaviors and ideas and beliefs and break through that.
yeah.
And yeah, I'd love to, I guess, talk to you more about that experience. And, is that where you see people making the difference? Or, I know you talk about the different ways you can participate in capitalism to make the difference, whether it's you and Kelly and actually bringing food and culture to people and educating them that way, or the way that you employ people. How do you see as the most powerful way to participate and be
Mm,
a capitalist where it's focused, it's people focused?
yeah, that's an awesome question. I think that the most powerful way to participate in capitalism, especially when you're thinking about a kind of Black capitalist framework, is to participate in a way that's not going to reproduce or create harm. And that becomes the baseline. And then the exciting part is that anyone can take it from there, right? If you imagine capitalism to be this pie, we all have a slice of the pie. Some slices are bigger than others. Some of us have different life chances, life circumstances that give us more access to resources than others. But that doesn't kind of disallow anyone to still participate. And for some, if you're an entrepreneur like Sangu, who kind of operates as this kind of cultural bridge, given his experiences, in the West, and then also the work that he does in Ghana, he's able to kind of take the best of the best, if you will, and imagining and vision for how to create economic power in a Pan-African sense and create value for African people, especially in contexts where the value on the African continent is usually extracted and then distributed to other parts of the world. But how do you center the value and create it for the people who live there and create the value in the first place? And also, have these kind of cultural tweaks, if you will, to embed more equity and a greater sense of people feeling acknowledged for the intrinsic value that they have. So that's one example. Or if you're in a corporate context, you can think about how can I create in the seat that I'm in more opportunities and access for the people who are outside of these walls. And there's so many different ways you can do that, whether it's getting involved in recruitment or retention strategies. A lot of these employee resource groups, if you will, take on volunteers, and you mentioned earlier a really powerful statement around it's hard to be something that you can't see.
Mhm.
And so I think so much of the work and some of the people that I talk to in corporate, they're thinking about how can I just become a model, bring people in, mentor them. And there's so many different ways to do it, and so I think even when it becomes more grassroots, we're living in a moment where financial literacy is so top of mind. You see it all over social media. You have these, I think they're called finfluencers, like financial influencers on social media. And I think so much knowledge has become democratized around how you can build wealth. Some of it is misinformation, but some of it is good, and so I think now you see these different kind of groups pop up around real estate groups or different kind of financial literacy groups where people come together and they think about, especially in a kind of home ownership context, like, okay, if you've got good credit, I might not have the best credit. How can we work together to unlock opportunities for home ownership or commercial ownership as well? And so these become just examples of how people are doing it in a way where, because again, Black capitalism is still a story about profitability, but it's about how do you do it in community? How do you ensure that your access to ownership is not predicated on someone else's exploitation? And there
Yeah.
are ways to do it. And so it's just a matter of tapping into creativity, tapping into community in order to unlock ideas and then action to achieve, those kind of visions for how we might do things differently.
Yeah, and I think the really beautiful part of what we're talking about, obviously, all the different ways that you can do this is almost like you said, the baseline. Just don't create harm. Participate in a way that isn't making anyone worse off, and then it's almost what you then have capacity for.
Yes.
Some people have more capacity to shake up the system in different ways, and I think it's not putting all the responsibility on certain people. And of course, white people have more responsibility to actually question the system, change it, and actually work in a way that they take advantage of their privilege and do more with that. And I know that in the book you speak about living with the white family and almost feeling as though oh no, not even feeling, but you did have to become the educator on the Black experience. And again, that's exhausting. Just a really important point that I want to make is, of course, he said information is so much more democratized now. So there's no excuse for white people or people from other groups not to educate themselves as well, rather than
Yeah.
putting that onus on. But thinking about, I feel there's a lot of what you said in what you just mentioned, and participating in capitalism is about almost creating, although it's still for profit, using that profit and that excess to then give back to the community. And it made me think of your grandmother. And
Mm.
such a beautiful part
Yeah.
of what I read in the book was how, firstly, she was just this strong, empowered woman participating in an industry that was male dominated and also really quite cutthroat. So amazing, firstly, just full stop.
Mhm.
But then the beauty in the fact that if there was people in her house when she would get this payment or profit from her tenants because it was in real estate, she would give it away. And she made this comment of, in order to receive, you have to give. And of
Mhm.
course, to firstly have that mindset when, especially, I mean, in a society where there is less resource for, yeah, especially Black people, to get out of that mindset and believe so strongly that actually I need to give and give back to the people around me to receive was
Hmm.
so beautiful. And I can imagine that was a really kind of special moment when you got to witness that. I think that was in maybe your 20s.
Yeah.
You went back to Ghana.
Yeah, it's she's the model for a black capitalist kind of posture, and yeah, the fact that she's transitioned now, but to have been so successful, to be an anchor in my own family, but then also an anchor in the community with that ethos that, you can't get anything good in this world without giving and sacrificing something to others and being in service of others. And so, really teaching me that through doing it and living it was a really kind of incredible thing. Um, and so, yeah, I think I always harken back to that because it was also when I saw that and had that experience, it was in my early 20s when I was just wrestling with who I was going to be. I think there's this critical moment, at least for me, whereby, I graduated undergrad and, was getting my start professionally. And you can kind of get swept away, especially in a big place like Goldman. You can drink the Kool-Aid at whatever institution that you're at and lose sight sometimes in terms of what really matters, who really matters. And so for me to go back home and to just see and witness what it looks like to do well, do good, as I think that's a common adage we hear all the time, that's really anchored on people and being in community. Because again, I think it ruptured some of these ideas about how Black people can relate to wealth, as something that is accessible, can be attainable, but it's not this kind of individualism that capitalism we know today is really anchored on, which reproduces in us a kind of scarcity mindset, this sense of I'm in it for myself. I don't need anybody else in order to achieve any kind of thriving or success for myself. And it gives us these kind of social scripts that are just counter to what we actually need. And so it really becomes how do you really embody and believe in a kind of abundance mindset, that generosity is just a good thing to have and to do. But then also recognize it becomes the way in which you can have and live in community with people that's going to get you closer to thriving in the different ways that we want to realize it in our lives.
Yeah. And I really want to touch on that topic as well, how getting sucked away and almost it being really easy to lose yourself. And I
Yeah.
think what I speak to some of my, especially my black friends within the financial industry, and I think also there is an essence as a woman as well, being in a male dominated area and, not being always the norm in the room, kind of being the odd one out. I think there is this mask that you have to put on.
Mm,
And there is this energy expended in not being able to be necessarily your authentic self. That means that a lot of energy is lost that way, and it's almost impossible to compete with people who don't have to worry about that and they must have so much excess energy. um, and I can imagine, yeah, it's really easy to fight with that and think I go into work and I have to almost become this person that maybe doesn't feel quite right. I can't
mm,
always speak about what I believe in. I
mm,
think there's a powerful part that you mentioned in your book about the series industry. And when, there's that question of someone says something that is inappropriate or completely unacceptable, and you have to make that decision there and then. Do I say something? Do I sit back, which has other internal issues, like what's going on inside and the dissonance between what you believe and what you're having to project into the world.
mhm.
How, as you've gotten old and obviously you have worked in the financial industry, and what's amazing if you've found roles in which you are, I guess, doing what you're passionate about as well. Have you how have you reconciled that? Do you feel as though you're now in your role at JP Morgan in a position where you can kind of take down that mask more? And,
Mm,
what has that experience been like throughout your career?
mm. It's a great question. I think it has gotten easier to express myself, but I'm still always strategic about when I take off that mask, to use your language, or when I choose to quote unquote go there, you
Hmm.
know, and kind of create moments whereby I'm engaging, my colleagues or stakeholders to think about things in a different way. I think it's always important to pick your battles, and not everything is a fight. So it's not about like positioning it that way, but it does require a level of emotional intelligence to know when you're going to invite and create a context for what might be a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
And so having the wherewithal in yourself to create that moment, but also invite people and still create an energy where people feel safe. Because sometimes, when you're talking about race or quote unquote sensitive conversations, it can, make people feel guarded. And so, how can you create spaces to disarm people? Because, hey, we're all here. How can we do this thing in a way that's going to be, you know, just a little bit more peaceful for all of us,
Yeah.
kind of evoking my chill spirit. Like, that's always kind of how can we just coexist peacefully?
Yeah.
Um, but it's still a challenge. It was interesting because a couple of days ago, I was interviewed by a podcast host, and he was asking me about authenticity, how I think about that in relation to these, moments that present themselves. And that's that question of like, what do I say? What do I do? Do I do nothing? And it's not a question to me of authenticity. It's not like I'm
Mhm.
any less myself, but it's just the reality and the self awareness of when I'm in certain spaces, these spaces require something else of me or something different in order to achieve my ultimate objective, whatever that might be in a space.
Mhm.
So you operate with a sense of kind of tactfulness because you know the space that you're in. So it's about knowing where you are.
Yeah.
And also knowing the reality that how I choose to behave might garner a different set of outcomes. And if someone else chooses to behave in the same way.
Yeah.
And however unfortunate, because it is, it's also still the reality. And so it's more so for me to dial down the emotions around it and really dial up the strategy and intentionality, which I think over time it's a skill that I've been trying to like grow over the years. And that's been more so how I think about it now.
Yeah.
Um, but it's still never, okay, I'm just going to say anything or express anything, but really being intentional. I think also, especially working, in finance, so much of the desires I have for how we can embed equity into the work that we do, I know has to be delivered and talked about through a business context. And that becomes really important. And so it's like you got to know the language of the people that you're talking to,
Mm.
speak their language in order to be compelling to them. And that takes time to kind of learn the
Mm.
language of the culture. And sometimes it feels subversive, or it's like, I know I have this objective in mind. I know how my stakeholders work. How do I create that common ground?
Yeah.
Invite a conversation that speaks to that. But it's still an active choice and decision making process.
Yeah. And it's so interesting that you say this, and it makes me think of kind of an experience that I've had in which, or I mean, multiple, but you enter the working world and you're confronted with situations that you deem inappropriate, unacceptable. And I remember having this really difficult moment where my younger self would have been like, there's absolutely no way I would not have spoken up about this. I would have kind of made this person kind of face consequences. And I almost was really hard on myself. I'm like, I know that my younger self, or like this feminist inside of me that is being confronted with this situation, it's almost like, how dare I not, call this out? And I had to really sit there and think, well, why am I not calling this out? It's because it would alienate me in the workplace. I would not have certain sponsors that I do currently have that can help me get to where I want to go because they might see this person a certain way and kind of have allyship with them. I know that my end goal is to gain enough influence and power to create change. And so maybe I have to be more strategic about it and actually choose my battles, as you said. Again, it's not about a fight, but it's about looking at the bigger picture. And I actually remember kind of a younger version of me, I think year nine here, which means I was about 12 years old, and I was sat next to this boy in class. I remember I was saying, like what I want to do, I really want to like make a huge impact. So I need to earn loads of money, firstly, and then I can change the world. And it was like he was like, well, why don't you go to politics? I was like, because you can't make a change in politics. You need money. You need money and power. So I'm going to get that. And I think this is where it's so important to give people access to this. And obviously, it's a shame that you need money to gain power. But it makes me think of, again, a situation, or actually a phrase that you used in your book, where it was the fact that, money almost gives you dignity because people don't have the power to humiliate you anymore because you have choices. And I
Mm,
thought that was so powerful. It's this idea that money gives options,
mm,
and even just from an individual point of view, you then don't have to do things that you don't necessarily want to do.
mm,
And so I would love to, yeah, touch on that topic with you on, and there's a point where you were really young, and I think a member of your church that made you clean because they gave you lifts, and that kind of
mhm.
humiliating situation. And do you feel as though that was a turning point for you when you thought, okay, this is actually necessity for me to have money, and then how that
Yeah,
relationship developed?
yeah. I think it was not even the act of, the youth pastor at that time kind of requiring that of us. Um, it was my mom's response to the youth pastor's kind of orientation to us, and seeing how upset she got about it and her rationale for it, but then also how she was talking about, you don't see the youth pastor asking, these other kids to come clean the church. And I think that's what kind of opened my eyes to the reality that people will treat you differently based on the money in your pocket. And people treat you differently based on who's even holding the money, because sometimes you can have it, but that doesn't always necessarily, as we spoke to earlier, ensure that you'll be treated with dignity and treated with respect. And so that's what kind of breeds the irony, right? Where it's like, okay, you're chasing kind of financial security with the hopes that it'll create new outcomes, but racism is still racism. And regardless of how much money you have, you're still susceptible to disrespect, and different forms of oppression. And so, yeah, it becomes this weird thing. And I think at the end of the day, and how unfortunate it is, I think capitalism interspersed and interconnected to racism, sexism, all of these different ills, continue to make it challenging to just feel a sense of freedom, feel a sense of self autonomy in a way that's going to be received well in whatever space that you occupy. But I think that's where community becomes really important, because it's one thing to be wealthy alone. It's a whole nother thing to be wealthy in community, because I do think that money is power, as you mentioned, knowledge is power, but money can also be economic power at a communal level that then creates potential change. I think what's so compelling about the work that Sangu does, for example, is he's really focused on how do you create economic power at scale in a kind of pan African sense that's going to change the kind of negotiating power that African countries have at the world stage. It's one thing if Ghana goes to the world stage negotiating on account of the roughly 40 million people who live in the country. It's another thing if you have 54 African countries operating with one unified voice, one unified objective, and negotiating at that level, with countries throughout the world. And so that's what then, in addition to other things, of course, but creates tangible change as well. And so, because we live in the moment that we do, because we live in an imperfect system, there's going to be imperfection, even still, as we strive for positivity, as we strive for change and liberation. But that's where I think it becomes so important to do this work, even still, in community, in relation to other people, as a way to not just build power at scale, it's sustainable, but also to start to really counter in a scalable way some of the realities of racism, sexism, etc. And it's not necessarily going to change things on the individual level, where people might still disrespect me on account of just me being a Black woman. But I think it creates some kind of tangible change, even in my own life, when it comes to a greater sense of security, a greater sense of thriving, um, even still in this imperfect house that we all have to occupy, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a perfect story by any means, but it is around more opportunities and pathways we can create to private ownership, communal ownership, which then translates into political power, as well as kind of what you're speaking to make change, create new kind of systems that, are imbued with more equity and more justice
Right.
does mean something.
Yeah, definitely. I actually remember there was a point in your book, something that really stuck with me, where you said you can't like work or outwork kind of the physical insecurity and like unsafety, like there's no amount of money that can create that safety. And so I guess what you're talking about, you almost need like economic power and the community around it to then also contribute to that. I mean, I guess change and also safety, because you're surrounded by other
Yeah.
people. There's power in numbers and safety in numbers. And when
Mhm.
it comes to Africa and presenting on the world stage as kind of larger numbers, again, it works in that sense as well. It's a louder voice. People have to hopefully listen more when there's more people speaking.
Yeah, I mean, you even take protests, for example. Oftentimes, the most successful ones, quote unquote, are attached to changes based on economics. I think Black people historically, within the context of capitalism, have had the role as kind of consumers, and that's been the most accessible pathway to participate in capitalism. So when we withhold our dollars, then people are listening. And we see so many instances of that. And so it's like, how do you tap into the strategies, the tools of capitalism to create new outcomes? And so I think there's so many different ways to think about that, because honestly, people most oftentimes feel agentic or powerful when they're voting. And, people will think, oh, well, that only happens every so often. But the reality is, we vote every single day, multiple times a day with our wallets. And so when I talk about, it's not just this passive orientation that we have to capitalism as if it's this system that we have no say over. We have say every single day, and we show our say. And so if we start voting in different ways, being intentional about what I said before, no harm as part of that, and we're organizing in a way that connects people, because it's not about wealthy versus the poor. We are in community with each other. Some of us have resources in certain ways, some of us have resources in other ways. So, how do we bring that together to, again, address the moment that we're in, to kind of usher us towards the kind of reality that we're wanting to create?
Yeah, definitely. And I think something that I do want to touch on as well is, talking about lots of people's voices coming together. And obviously, your book is an example of that, because you did interview so many people and you also brought in voices from kind of academics like Du Bois and thought leaders and Jay-Z. And so, kind of, you did that yourself as well. You kind of gave people this voice and you've created this resource that people can refer to. But what I found really interesting is you kind of made the comment that you shared your own voice, and to protect other Black women that you spoke to, you didn't share their stories.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to talk a bit about that and where the lack in safety comes from there. What is it that you felt you're protecting them from, for kind of other people's awareness, and how has the reaction to sharing your own story been, and what was that process in being the vulnerable one yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as a student of anthropology, which, funny enough, I never took an anthro class in undergrad. It was just the case that my favorite professors were anthropologists. And so that's what kind of put it in my mind to study anthropology. which now that I look back on, I'm like, oh, I should have done a little bit more research on that. But by the time I got to grad school and I was taking Anthro 101, I was realizing just how fraught the discipline is with its problematics.
Mm.
For so long, anthropology has been kind of positioned, especially when you look at certain syllabi and how they kind of talk about and teach the discipline. You have these white men who travel to the corners of the world and they study quote unquote primitive people who are backwards, and these are people of course who live in and are part of the global south, and would study their cultures and systems and their rituals and
Mm.
report back. And so often, all these studies were not done really in community with these people. And that was best in class, of how anthropology is done, how you do ethnography. And it prompted for me all these questions around power and access and knowledge production. And, um, there's this saying that history favors the victor,
Mhm.
and how history is written is through the lens of the victor. And I think anthropology is really no different. History and knowledge is written through the lens of the anthropologist, not necessarily through the lens and through the voice of the people that the anthropologist has gone to study. And so there are all these problematics around power. And I was like, oh man, this discipline is kind of messed up, And so then it was the question for myself, how was I going to be an anthropologist? How was I going to do it differently in a way that was going to be equitable and actually in community with the people that gave me their time, gave me their stories? And so when I was doing, the research specific to Wall Street and talking with people who are in finance, I did speak to a number of women. And what was interesting is that we shared so many similar experiences about just lack of access to promotions, lack of access to high profile scopes of work, um, working 10 times as hard, not being seen or compensated for it. So all of these kind of themes were alive, in all the women that I spoke to. But the worry that I kept hitting against was, even though I was offering anonymity
Mm.
to these women and how I would communicate and tell their stories, there was still this fear and worry that they would still be identified some way, somehow. And I think it just spoke to the immense vulnerability that especially Black women can have, because you'll get burned sometimes. And
Mm.
so many of them have experienced it when they'll be in moments of vulnerability and share, and it comes back around
Mm.
some way, somehow. And so there's become this like learning over time that you have to be um, really prioritize your privacy in order to have some level of safety, especially in a corporate context. And so I was then presented with this question internally of, well, what do I do? As an anthropologist, invested in doing it differently, I did not want to just say, okay, I acknowledge that, but I have these stories, so I'm just going to publish them still. It was more so, how can I, acknowledge and respect the worries and concerns of my interlocutors, but still give voice to the most important and compelling themes with which I still derived. And so that's why I made the choice to kind of put the attention on myself to, one, address the fact that I think in a lot of ways embody so much of the stories that I receive from these women, while not exposing them to potential repercussions because of their involvement with this study and with this work. And so I think for me, similar to a kind of Black capitalist ethos, it's, you have these systems that are imperfect, but then how do you use the tools of them, in this case ethnography, to create moments of greater equity, moments of
Mm.
acknowledgement, and do it differently? And so I think that was really important for me as an anthropologist, because I did not want to reproduce so many of the harms that I've seen in the discipline. So yeah, that's how that came to be.
Yeah, and I think that's amazing because you're really living what you believe. You're creating the outcome, and there could have been benefit to you in sharing those stories. It could, like, in so many different ways, but you're choosing to protect those around you and you're like really leading by example and you're not compromising that. And I think that's amazing for people to see. And
Mm.
I realize we've been kind of talking for ages. Honestly, I could talk to you all day. But what I'm going to have to do is, I read this book, honestly, I've got a notes page.
Oh,
It goes on and on and on. There's just like quotes from you. There's things that you said that really resonated with me. And then there's kind of my own commentary around it. I'm just going to have to force loads of other people to read your book so that I can then talk to them about it. And I will, honestly, I've already spoken about it. And actually, what might be quite funny, and I think first I want to thank you for creating this resource and not just for me to educate myself, but also I think I can imagine for other Black people, it actually gives them a tool that can be used to educate people who aren't Black, who don't have the same experience without them having to explain it. So it takes
mm.
some of that burden by having another resource in this world that people can use to educate themselves. And
Oh,
it will make you laugh, maybe, because before I read this book, I was actually on a date with a white guy who's in finance and a really nice person. And we were just having this conversation about capitalism. And of course, I work in finance.
yeah.
He works in the finance world, and he was saying how capitalism is really great because it really, if people have an idea and they want to do something, they can. It can be rewarded. It creates opportunities. And I almost had to stop him and say, but that is because you're based on the right side of capitalism. I can completely understand where you're coming from. I'm benefiting from capitalism all the time.
Mm,
But there's also people who don't have the same experience with it. And, he listened and everything and, give him his due. He was completely open to being educated on it. And so I came at the stance from being a woman participating in capitalism. But the second that this book came out, I sent it to him. And we're not actually dating anymore, but I still was just like, do you remember that conversation we had? Maybe this would be really interesting.
oh, wow. I was gonna ask, was there a second date?
Yeah, so there was after this, like that, like
Oh,
he reacted in a great way, and I still have a lot of respect and yeah
yeah.
for this person. But I just think this is what I mean when it's like a really great resource because there's a lot of people out there who don't know what they don't know, and
Mhm.
sometimes they're participating in a dangerous way and might not even know it.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you firstly for
Oh, thank you.
creating what I'm sure is amazing food of Kerewere, doing everything that you're doing in finance to change what that looks like for people. And I know that you're helping reimagine like wealth
Mm,
management and how that can actually benefit different societies and also of course this book. And I would
mm,
love to just finish in asking you maybe two questions.
okay.
One of them is, how are you now kind of repaying yourself for all the
Mm,
work that you've done? You've
mm.
got to this point, you've just published this book, and I would just love to hear, or maybe if you're not doing this, tell you that, you should kind of be really celebrating yourself. And I would just love to know how you are doing that if you are.
Oh, I love that question. I haven't done it yet in the last like 2 weeks, but I'm going to be sleeping a lot any moment I get. I love to sleep. I love to just kind of like mosey around and do nothing. My boyfriend was just telling me, "You're really lazy." I was like, "Yes, I have everything else to do." So I'm gonna spend some time just being lazy and resting. And I think also I love to travel, and that's, we talk about the evolution that I've had, growing up in my mother's home, and honestly, like taking moments of rest, I would feel guilty,
Yeah.
especially in my early 20s. And I'd always think like, oh, there's some work that I should be doing that I can do right now. Like, why am I resting? Or if I, treat myself to something nice, I'm like, did I really need to spend the money on that? So those were the questions. But now, I think as years have gone on and I've learned to be more gentle with myself and show myself more compassion and pay myself back, as you say, it's about, okay, what are the things I actually enjoy doing? Having hobbies. And it felt like a silly question to ask myself, but when I first asked myself, I didn't really have any. And so that became the worry where it's like, okay, I really need to sit down and figure this out. And so travel became something. And again, I think it's because I'm an anthropologist. I love learning from people, seeing how people live and do life. Um, So I will take a lot of trips throughout the year and just see. I think for me, it's I really love to see things I haven't seen before because it always helps me wrestle with my preconceived notions and I think be sharper in mind, but then also in relating with people too. And so that's something I plan on doing more. Um, and I'll travel and sleep. That's what I'll do.
I was so happy to hear you're going to sleep because I just feel like there's years of lack of sleep you need to make up for. But I'm really happy to hear that. And obviously, when you're in survival mode or what feels like survival mode, you might not even actually need to do something survive anymore, but you're still in that fight mode, kind of physically and mentally. You almost do feel like just being is a luxury. It's almost like, well, if I'm doing this, what's the purpose?
Mhm,
You can't just
mhm.
paint a picture because it's fun. Because it's like, well, what am I going to do with that picture? Like maybe I should start selling artwork.
Right.
It kind of comes into this thing of like, how do I make everything productive?
Mhm,
So the fact that
mhm,
you're allowing yourself to sleep and then you're going to allow yourself to travel is amazing to hear. And I'm sure
mhm.
will give other people permission to do the same
I
thing for
hope
themselves.
so. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And then the final question is just going back to your younger self who is maybe in prep school, or maybe waking up at 4:30 a.m. and thinking, why is my mum making me do this? What advice would you give to her?
Oh man. It might not be advice, but just this, again, it's so personal to my experience. I would say it gets better. Um, I think I had such a isolated and kind of narrow view in those times. I didn't see my mom's bigger picture.
Mhm.
I also didn't see the bigger picture, even though those experiences in high school and, in childhood were difficult. I think that they were shaping in me different passions and curiosities that have now wound me here. And so when I say it gets better, everything I do think kind of serves a purpose, even if we don't understand it in the immediate moment or from someone else's vantage point. But I think if you stay close to the things that make you curious, make you question, you'll be surprised to see what the through line ends up
Mhm.
being in adulthood. And so I'd say, yeah, it can get better and appreciate the fact that you might not see the bigger picture now, but it'll unfold
Yeah.
and you can use it to your benefit. So that's what I'd say.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this whole conversation and everything that you do.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a gift to me, honestly. So I